Why does patience feel hardest precisely when it is most necessary? This question reveals a paradox at the center of human experience. Patience is often framed as a moral virtue, something associated with endurance, restraint, or emotional suppression. In popular language, to be patient is to wait quietly, to tolerate discomfort, or to signal moral maturity. But these definitions fail to explain why patience collapses so reliably under pressure, even in people who value it deeply. From a cognitive standpoint, patience is not primarily an ethical achievement. It is a perceptual and interpretive challenge. Modern psychology shows that impatience reliably emerges under specific neurological conditions: heightened amygdala activation associated with threat detection, reduced prefrontal cortex, regulation responsible for long-term planning, and a narrowing of attentional bandwidth during stress. In other words, impatience is not simply a lack of willpower. It is a shift in how reality is cognitively processed. This leads to a different question. What if patience is not about endurance at all, but about how reality is interpreted in the moment? This is where the work of Ibn Arabi becomes particularly relevant. Rather than treating patience as emotional strength, he frames it as a function of perception, meaning, and metaphysical alignment. In his system, patience fails not because emotions are weak, but because reality is being misunderstood. To understand why patience feels increasingly inaccessible today, it is necessary to examine the conditions under which the modern mind operates. Contemporary life is characterized by chronic stress, environment's continuous information exposure, and algorithm-driven attention fragmentation. The nervous system is rarely given extended periods of stability. Instead, it is repeatedly pulled into cycles of alertness, evaluation, and reaction. Several psychological mechanisms reinforce impatience under these conditions. Dopaminergic reward conditioning, driven by instant feedback loops in digital systems, trains the brain to expect rapid resolution and immediate gratification. Attention biases toward threat and loss increase vigilance and urgency. Cognitive distortions, such as and temporal compression, make delayed outcomes feel disproportionately dangerous or personal. From a neuroscientific perspective, stress shortens perceived time horizons. Under pressure, the brain prioritizes immediate resolution over long-term coherence. This bias once served survival, but in complex modern systems it often missed. The result is emotional reactivity, a loss of meaning during periods of waiting, and a sense of personal failure when outcomes take longer than expected. Crucially, this means that modern impatience is not a moral flaw. It is a misalignment between perception and temporal reality. Ibn Arabi offers a framework in which impatience arises not from weakness, but from misidentifying the self's role within unfolding reality. Ibn Arabi was an Andalusian philosopher, metaphysician, and jurist, whose work is often mischaracterized as poetic mysticism. While his language can be symbolic, his underlying framework is rigorously ontological and he was deeply concerned with how reality unfolds, how knowledge is structured, and how human perception interfaces with causality. A common misconception is that Ibn Arabi emphasizes emotional surrender. In fact, he repeatedly critiques unexamined emotional responses. His system is concerned with accuracy, particularly accuracy about the human position within reality. One of his core premises is that reality unfolds through divine ordering, or tartbeh, and continuous creation known as Taj al-Khalq. Existence is not static, it is renewed at every moment through layered causality. Human suffering intensifies when the ego assumes authorship over outcomes or resists temporal unfolding. Within this framework, patience kabara is not endurance or repression. It is accurate cognition of one's ontological position. It is understanding what kind of agent one actually is within a reality that is continuously forming. This leads directly to the core teachings that explain why patience collapses and how it can be restored. The first core teaching is deceptively simple. Patience is the alignment of perception with how reality actually unfolds, not how the ego expects it to. Ibn Arabi argues that suffering intensifies when perception outruns reality. Impatience emerges when expectations move faster than ontological timing. The ego asserts, often unconsciously, this should already be resolved. But this assumption ignores the layered causality through which outcomes emerge. From a modern scientific perspective, this aligns closely with predictive processing theory. The brain is constantly generating predictions about the future. Emotional distress increases when prediction errors persist, when reality repeatedly fails to match expectations without the model being updated. Impatience in this sense is sustained prediction error without perceptual recalibration. Consider a real-world example: waiting for career progression or physical healing. The mind forecasts a specific timeline. Reality unfolds more slowly. Emotional friction arises not because waiting is inherently painful, but because the internal model remains rigid. Patience improves not by waiting harder, but by updating mental models to reflect reality's actual pacing. It is a perceptual correction, not a moral effort. The second teaching addresses how time itself is understood. Ibn Arabi rejects the idea of empty waiting time. In his view, time is never neutral duration. Every moment contains active configurations of meaning and subtle causal rearrangements. Impatience assumes that nothing is happening yet. This assumption is false, but it feels true, because many processes unfold below sensory visibility. Modern psychology reinforces this insight. Temporal discounting shows that humans undervalue delayed outcomes. Meanwhile, the brain's default mode network often generates negative narratives when external stimulation decreases. When meaning is absent, impatience thrives. A clear example is medical recovery. Healing processes occur at cellular and systemic levels long before symptoms visibly improve. Impatience arises not from inactivity but from invisibility. Reframing time as active rather than empty restores meaning to duration. When time is understood as generative, emotional agitation decreases. Patience emerges naturally when waiting is no longer interpreted as stagnation. For Ibn Arabi, resistance to reality is the primary amplifier of distress. Reality is already occurring. Psychological pain increases when the mind adds a second layer: this should not be happening. Patience is not passive acceptance, it is the removal of internal opposition. This principle closely mirrors acceptance and commitment. Therapy, which models suffering as pain multiplied by resistance. Emotional regulation improves when events are observed without judgment, while cognitive fusion over identification with thoughts increases impatience. Consider social conflict or systemic injustice. Emotional burnout often occurs not because the situation is complex, but because outcomes are demanded immediately. Resistance drains cognitive resources that could otherwise support strategic action. Patience, in this sense, is not approval. It is non-interference with what already is. This preserves psychological energy and clarity. The fourth teaching concerns identity. Ibn Arabi distinguishes between the witnessing self, the acting self, and the controlling illusion. Impatience arises when the self claims total authorship over outcomes. This identity inflation creates constant tension, because reality inevitably exceeds personal control. Cognitive science supports this through locus of control theory. Realistic external attribution reduces stress, while false internal omnipotence increases anxiety and emotional volatility. In parenting leadership or activism, burnout often occurs when identity becomes fused with outcome control. When results lag, the self experiences it as personal failure. Patience increases when identity shifts from controller to participant. One still acts, but without the psychological burden of authorship. A natural question follows: if outcomes are not fully controlled, why act at all? Ibn Arabi's answer is precise. Action is required. Attachment to outcome is optional. Patience is not passivity, it is cognitive flexibility, temporal literacy, and ontological humility. This aligns with modern complexity theory. Nonlinear systems cannot be rushed without destabilization. Acting skillfully within such systems requires patience, not as virtue, but as rational strategy. Patience, then, is a logical response to complex causality. These insights translate into actionable cognitive practices. First, cognitive reframing. Remind yourself this moment is actively forming even if I cannot yet see how. Second, attention regulation. Shift focus from fixed outcomes to process variables, what can be adjusted, learned, or stabilized. Now. Third, identity checks. Ask whether you are reacting as a participant or as a frustrated controller. Fourth, emotion regulation. Label impatience as prediction error, not failure. These practices are supported by cognitive behavioral therapy, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and predictive coding models. They are not affirmations. They are perceptual corrections. To summarize, patience is perceptual accuracy. Time is active, not empty. Resistance multiplies suffering. Identity determines emotional capacity. When patience feels impossible, the issue is not endurance, it is interpretation. Patience emerges naturally when reality is understood correctly,